In this video, we are going to talk about landscaping in Unreal. So the first thing that we need to do before we start sculpting is to set up the landscape and delete the default landscape. So I'm going to navigate over to the outliner and open this up. And I'm going to find my landscape option and open that drop down. Select all of the landscaping and just hit delete. So let's add a new landscape. We'll begin by changing our mode. So let's switch to the landscaping mode here at the top right and go to the landscaping tab. So we can't sculpt on something that we don't have. So let's go over to the manage tab and we're going to click on the new icon here. So this is what I get by the default when I click on new. And this panel looks like a bunch of technical dropdowns, but it's basically answering one question. How big is the ground and how detailed is the grid that makes it? In Unreal, landscapes are not just one mesh, they're a grid made out of chunks. Let's get into the actual setup. So edit layers lets you sculpt terrain and stack non-destructive layers. For this assignment, we can keep things simple and work destructively, kind of counterintuitive, but since this is most of your first time working in Unreal Engine, we want to keep things pretty simple. If you were building a large production environment, this would probably be worth using, but I'm going to uncheck mine. If you wanted to explore layers on your own, feel free to keep this checked. The next section here is our world partition. These settings are for large open world streaming. They control what parts of a massive map load and unload during gameplay. Our scene is small enough that it lives inside one cell, so we're going to leave these at the default. For material, we'll set this up later, so we'll leave this blank as well. That will be covered in the next video. Moving on to location, I'm going to set my location to 0, 0, 0, so that it's the same as the default landscape that each level starts with. And that's also where we're setting our props to come in at from when we export. So we'll set this to be at that base grid level. So first, let's talk about number of components. A component is a big tile of the landscape here. We can see right now I have it set to, by default, 8 by 8. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So each of these squares is a component. We definitely don't need something this large. I would recommend doing 4 by 4 or 3 by 3. So if I do 4 by 4, it's shrinking that and I'm making a grid of 16 large tiles. So why does this matter? Components affect how much terrain I have overall, how many chunks Unreal has to render, and how much data the landscape stores. So more components equal more area and more computing. Again, for this project, we're building a contained cinematic environment. We don't need like a whole open world terrain. So keeping the components small is good enough. So looking at selection size is the number of quads in each section. So how dense the grid is. The common values here are 63 by 63 or 127 by 127. It does give you these drop downs, and if we zoom in here and if we were to count out all of these, we would count 63 of them. So a bigger number here means more quads, which sounds like more details, but here's the catch. In Unreal, more quads also means bigger landscape in world space. And that's because Unreal landscapes treat each quad like real space. By default, one quad is 1 meter. So if you add more quads, you are literally adding more meters. So if you increase the selection size to 127 by 127, the terrain looks like it grows bigger, and it actually does. So again, I'm trying to keep things pretty optimized here, so I'm going to leave this one at the default of 63 by 63. which leads me into sections per component. Think of this as subdivisions inside each component. If I choose 1 by 1, each component is one solid grid chunk. And if I were to choose 2 by 2 sections, each component gets split into 4 smaller internal sections. And that can increase the sculpt detail, but it also increases the memory cost, weight map complexity for painting materials, and performance cost. So the important part here is that changing sections per component increases the number of quads inside each component, but remember that Unreal Landscapes treat each quad like real space, and adding more quads adds more meters. So this is different from Maya and other software like ZBrush or Blender, where if you subdivide a plane, it stays the same size but adds more topology within it. Whereas in Unreal, increasing the quads increases the world space unless you correct it. So in order for Unreal to compensate and fit that extra geometry, the landscape gets bigger. And the way to fix that is to change the scale, but you don't necessarily want to be changing the scales to fit all of that. I would highly recommend just leaving that at 1 by 1. And that's not to say 2 by 2 isn't wrong. It's just heavier on your computer. But before we get into scale, let's just talk about the overall resolution. And this is Unreal summarizing everything that we've chose above into a final grid size. So more resolution means more vertices, it means smoother sculpting, better detail, but also more stored data and more cost. And again, for this project, you don't need a massive resolution. We're just staging a scene. So you want a resolution that holds up sculpting without being a performance problem. So leaving this at the default is perfect. And if you notice that this number does change and update automatically when you change like the number of components. So if I were to change this to 5 or 6, the overall resolution changes. And if you were to do the math here, 4 components at 63 quads is basically 252. It's basically just doing the math, so we don't need to touch that as well. And then finally, we're getting back to scale. So up here you can see my scale is set to the default 100, 100, 100, which is 1 meter. If I were to change this to 50, we're halving it, we're getting that extra resolution, we're making the grid, the overall actual landscape smaller. And notice it will automatically update the X and the Y when you change that. So if I hit 100, again, we're back to the default. And then let's change this, just for example, 2 by 2 sections. If I were to have changed this to 50, it changes back into that size that I had at 1 by 1. But I have more resolution here. So that's sort of how you can compensate again for that if you wanted that extra level of subdivisions. But again, for something like this, leaving this at the default is highly recommended because you get the standard scale that behaves predictably. So here's the main rule that I want you guys to follow and to think about and keep in mind while you're setting up your own landscape is to pick a landscape that fits your scene and commit to it. And you're going to sculpt on top of that. It's not really a good idea to be changing these section sizes later, to be adding those components, etc. You can always delete a component by selecting it and deleting it. Something like this, or even a 3 by 3 is perfect because we start zooming in here to where my scaled objects are, right? This is a lot of space that I'm working with. So I can easily sculpt terrain to fit in the background here. Even if I were to have changed this to 3 by 3, this still looks like I have a lot to work with. And so these are my settings, and I'll hit create and it adds it to the outliner. I now have my ground that I can start sculpting on. Once you hit create, it does automatically switch you over to the sculpting tab. And now that everything is set up, we can actually start sculpting and forming the terrain. So now we're in the Sculpt tab, and this is where we modify the height map, meaning we're physically changing the terrain geometry. Before we talk tools, let's understand the brush controls. So the brush size controls how wide the tool affects the terrain. The fall off controls how soft the edges of that influence are, and the strength controls how aggressively that terrain moves. So we're going to use a large brush to block in major forms and a small brush to refine. So looking up here, I have all of these icons. We are just going to use the first 7. We're not going to worry about any of the other ones in this video. So Sculpt is the default height tool. To use it, you just click and drag to raise the terrain, and you can hold shift to lower it. So I can carve valleys and mountains this way. So I have different brush types. By default, you're on the simple circular brush, and it has a sub-menu of the brush fall off. So you can change it from a smooth to sharp. So I just recommend playing around with some of these and then figuring out what each of them do on your own is probably the best way to discover what tools you might need for your specific project. At the beginning, I would recommend not carving details, just getting those big shapes in. The next brush that we have is smooth. So this is going to smooth your mesh. Again, don't forget that you can change the strength of it and the size just by clicking on these sliders. So too much smoothing will flatten everything. And speaking of flatten, that is our next icon here. And the flatten tool takes the point where your brush cursor is and creates a flat area to match that height. This is good for clearing flat areas for buildings or creating controlled plateaus. But I do want to mention how aggressive it can be. So just be careful while you're using it. So if I were to, come up here and click, it's going to give me a flattened area at that height. So whatever height it is looking at, that is where it's going to flatten to until you release and you choose a new point. The next tool here is the ramp. It's going to create a ramp between 2 points. This will create a clean incline. It's useful for pathways or structure transitions, controlled slopes. So if I click on that and I choose 1 point here and I click up here and let's turn around, you can see that I can, move this, and then I can click on the button here that says add ramp and it will generate a slope for me. I can change the width of it and the side fall off as well. So let's add a second one here. So lots of things to play with. The next 3 icons here, I would recommend using really lightly. They are going to add variation and breaks in the uniform surfaces. So looking at erosion, and I start clicking and dragging, it's like simulating natural weathering. Same thing for hydro. It's simulating if there were to have been a bunch of rain or water in a specific area. Again, I would just recommend looking at the different tools here. And then noise as well is going to create just variation in your mesh. My advice is to sculpt a general landscape at first, but really when we get into cameras, that might be when you want to really get into the landscaping, because where your camera is and what's going to be showing is really going to inform how you want your landscape to look. To get out of landscape mode, you just need to go back up to the drop down and choose selection. And now we can click on our objects again. I can hit F on the keyboard to focus. So if I pretend that I am the camera here, I just want to look at what's in view of like where my camera might be and sculpt my terrain from there. So maybe I'll go back into landscape and, sculpt from here if I, sort of knew what I was looking for. So thinking about where your camera is going to be will be really helpful. Remember that we will have an animated camera, so just thinking about where your camera is going to be, what is it going to see, and sculpting your terrain that way. And really, we're just trying to hide the like straight flatness so that it doesn't look like the world is ended and there's a huge drop off. In the next video, we're going to go over materials, how to add different types of materials and blend them on top of each other. And then in another video, we'll go over how to paint in foliage so you don't have to place your foliage by hand. We can paint it in. So look out for those two. And yeah, happy sculpting.